Just after 3 a.m., a Royal Mail train thundered through the English countryside on its overnight journey to London. Inside one heavily guarded carriage were millions in cash. Then, without warning, a railway signal turned red. The driver did exactly what he had been trained to do. He stopped. For a few seconds, nothing happened. No voices. No movement. Just silence. Then, out of the darkness, men wearing gloves emerged from the shadows. What happened over the next 17 minutes would become one of the most perfectly planned robberies in modern history. No bullets were fired. No passengers were killed. Yet by sunrise, millions had vanished. But here's the question that still fascinates investigators today. If the robbery was planned with almost military precision, what single mistake caused nearly the entire gang to be captured? To answer that, we have to go back several months, to the moment this impossible crime was only an idea inside one man's mind. The Great Train Robbery didn't begin beside a railway track. It began around a table, months before a single signal was touched or a train was stopped. A small group of experienced criminals gathered in London with one impossible question. What if we didn't rob a bank? What if we robbed the money before it ever reached one? At the center of that conversation was a man named Bruce Reynolds. Unlike reckless thieves chasing quick cash, Reynolds believed every successful robbery was won long before the crime itself. His philosophy was simple. The less violence, the greater the chance of escape. But there was one problem. None of the men sitting in that room had ever attempted anything on the scale. Stealing a train carrying government money wasn't just risky. It sounded impossible, which raised an even bigger question. How do you stop a moving train without triggering an immediate national emergency? For weeks, the gang searched for answers. Then, everything changed. Someone approached them with information that should never have existed outside Britain's postal service. Not rumors, not guesses, precise operational details. The exact train, its route, its schedule, even the carriage that carried the cash. Suddenly, this impossible dream no longer looked impossible. It looked achievable. But there was still one obstacle standing between the gang and millions of dollars. They knew which train to rob. They still had no idea how to steal it. And solving that problem would force them to recruit people who could either make history or destroy the entire plan before it even began. Every great robbery begins with one advantage. This one began with a secret. As the gang studied Britain's railway network, they kept running into the same problem. They could stop a train, but they had no way of knowing which journey would carry enough cash to make the risk worthwhile. Without that information, the entire operation was nothing more than a dangerous gamble. Then, someone from the inside changed everything. The source didn't simply provide a tip. They revealed details that were never meant to leave the Royal Mail system. Which train would carry the high-value packages? Where that valuable carriage would be attached? How the overnight postal operation worked? And most importantly, when an unusually large amount of cash would be on board. To the gang, this wasn't luck. It was the missing piece they had been searching for. But another question immediately appeared. If someone inside was willing to leak confidential information, how much else did they know? Were they simply passing along information? Or were they secretly helping to design the robbery itself? Investigators would spend years chasing that answer. Some believed the insider disappeared forever. Others believed that person was never identified at all. Whatever the truth, the gang now had something even more valuable than weapons. Certainty. They knew exactly which train to target, exactly when it would travel, and exactly which carriage contained the money. Everything was finally falling into place. Or so they believed, because there was one final obstacle they still couldn't solve. Stopping the train was easy. Moving it was another story entirely. None of them knew how to operate a modern railway locomotive. And without someone in the driver's seat, months of planning could collapse in a matter of seconds. So the gang made a decision that would become one of the biggest risks of the entire operation. They decided to bring in another man. A man whose job wasn't to steal the money. It was to steal the train itself. The perfect robbery finally had a perfect target, but the man chosen to drive the train was about to create a problem nobody had anticipated. Every impossible crime has one defining moment. The moment when an idea becomes a real operation. Now that the gang knew which train to target, they faced a much bigger challenge. How do you stop one of Britain's most important trains without raising the alarm? Breaking onto the train wasn't enough. If the driver sensed danger, if he managed to send a warning, or if the train stopped in the wrong location, months of planning would collapse in seconds. So instead of relying on force, the gang chose something far more dangerous. Deception. They spent weeks studying the railway. Every signal, every crossing, every minute of the train's journey. Eventually, they found the perfect location. A quiet stretch of track where the train would be completely isolated from the public. No crowds, no witnesses, no immediate police response. It looked ordinary, which made it the perfect trap. Then they created the most important part of the entire operation. A fake red signal. The plan was brilliantly simple. Cover the green light. Power the red light with a portable battery. To the driver, everything would appear completely normal. And railway rules left him with only one choice. Stop the train. No chase. No gunfire. The railway itself would bring the money to them. But the gang knew one thing. The moment that train stopped, they would have almost no time. Every second increased the risk that another train, a railway worker, or the police could appear without warning. This wasn't a robbery. It was a race against time. And then, the night they had spent months preparing for finally arrived. None of them knew that the biggest problem wasn't waiting on the tracks. It was sitting inside the locomotive itself. Because the man chosen to drive the stolen train was about to discover something that threatened to destroy the entire operation. The plan to stop the train was flawless, but stealing it was about to become far more difficult than anyone had imagined. For months, the gang had planned every detail. Now there was no turning back. On the evening of August 7, 1963, the Royal Mail train departed Glasgow exactly as expected, beginning its overnight journey toward London. To everyone on board, it was just another routine shift. Mail was being sorted, schedules were being followed, and nothing appeared out of the ordinary. But hidden inside one particular carriage was the reason this entire operation existed. The high-value package coach. It carried bags filled with cash collected from across the country. Normally, the amount would have been significant. This night, it was extraordinary. Because of a recent bank holiday, far more cash than usual was being transported. The robbers knew this in advance, making this journey the most valuable target they had ever seen. As the train raced south through the darkness, another team was already in position, hidden beside the railway tracks, waiting. watching, listening. Nobody spoke more than necessary. Months of planning had led to this single moment. Then, just after 3:00 a.m., the operation began. One member of the gang quietly approached the railway signal. He carefully covered the green light, then powered the red signal using a portable battery. From a distance, everything looked completely genuine. Minutes later, the beam of the approaching locomotive appeared in the distance. The train was coming. There would be no second chance. Inside the cab, driver Jack Mills saw the red signal ahead. There was nothing unusual about obeying it. Ignoring it would have broken every railway rule. So he did exactly what decades of experience had taught him to do. He applied the brakes. The massive train rolled to a stop, exactly where the robbers wanted it. For a brief moment, silence filled the countryside. Then, the darkness came alive. Shadowy figures rushed toward the locomotive from both sides. The perfect plan had worked. But in the next few seconds, something happened that nobody had expected. A single act of resistance would change the entire robbery. The train had stopped exactly where the gang wanted, but they still had to take control of the locomotive, and the driver wasn't ready to surrender the moment the train stopped. Every second mattered. As the assistant driver climbed down to use the trackside telephone, he expected to contact the signal operator and report the unexpected red light. Instead, he discovered the telephone line had been cut. Before he could react, men emerged from the darkness and overpowered him. At almost the same time, another team stormed the locomotive. Driver Jack Mills refused to cooperate. For a brief moment, the entire operation hung in the balance. Then, one of the robbers struck Mills on the head with a metal object, leaving him seriously injured. It was the only major violence used during the robbery, but it would leave lasting consequences. Now the gang moved with military precision. While one team secured the locomotive, another uncoupled the first two coaches from the rest of the train. Everything behind them, the mail staff, the remaining carriages, were left stranded in the darkness. The gang's plan wasn't to unload the money where the train had stopped. They intended to move the locomotive and the valuable carriage to a nearby bridge, where trucks were already waiting. There was just one problem. The man they had recruited to drive the stolen train stared at the controls and froze. He had never operated this type of locomotive before. Months of planning, millions of dollars at stake, and now the entire operation was being threatened by one unexpected mistake. For a few tense moments, everything stopped. The gang had planned for almost every possibility, but not this. They had no choice. The injured Jack Mills was forced back into the driver's seat and ordered to move the locomotive to the waiting trucks roughly a mile away. Against impossible odds, the train moved once again. The robbery was still alive, but the most difficult part had only just begun. Because inside the high-value package carriage, more than 100 bags of cash still had to disappear before anyone could stop them. The gang had stolen control of the train, but now they faced their greatest enemy, not the police, but the clock. The train had reached the bridge. Now there was only one objective: take the money and disappear before anyone realized what had happened. The robbers forced open the door of the high-value package carriage. Inside, several postal workers were caught completely off guard. The gang quickly restrained them, ordering everyone to stay face down while the operation continued. Then, they came face to face with what they had risked everything for. Stack after stack. Bag after bag. Cash. Far more than most of them had ever seen in their lives. But there was a problem. The money wasn't neatly packed into a few boxes. It was spread across 128 heavy mail bags, weighing nearly 2.5 tons in total. For a brief moment, the gang realized something terrifying. Had they underestimated the weight? Every extra second increased the chance that another train, a railway worker, or the police could arrive. There was no time to panic. The gang immediately formed a human chain. One man pulled the bags from inside the carriage. Another passed them forward. Another loaded them into the waiting truck below. No shouting. No confusion. Every movement had been rehearsed in advance. It looked less like a robbery and more like a military logistics operation. Minute after minute, the truck became heavier. The carriage became emptier. Then someone checked the time. They had reached their limit. The gang made a decision that surprised investigators. Instead of trying to take everything, they abandoned the remaining bags. 8 bags of cash were left behind. To them, escaping alive was worth far more than squeezing out a little more money. Within minutes, the truck pulled away into the darkness. The Royal Mail train stood silent on the bridge. The postal workers were still tied up. And for the first time, Britain's most valuable train was no longer carrying Britain's money. It was already miles away. The robbery had been a stunning success. Or at least, that's what the gang believed. Because while they celebrated their greatest victory, they had already made a mistake that would quietly begin destroying everything they had built. But no one noticed it. Not yet. The robbery was over in just 17 minutes, but the investigation that followed would last for years, and the gang's biggest enemy was no longer time. It was the evidence they didn't know they had left behind. As the first light of dawn began to spread across the English countryside, the gang believed they had done the impossible. They hadn't just stolen millions. They had outsmarted Britain's railway system. Their truck disappeared down quiet country roads before anyone fully understood what had happened. Behind them, the Royal Mail train remained motionless, while the crew and postal workers slowly realized they had become victims of one of the most audacious robberies in British history. For the robbers, the next few hours were just as important as the robbery itself. They arrived at a remote farmhouse that had been rented months earlier under false identities. This wasn't a random hiding place. It had been chosen because it was isolated, quiet, and far enough from the crime scene to avoid immediate suspicion. Inside, the atmosphere changed completely. The tension that had dominated the previous 17 minutes was replaced by celebration. For the first time, they allowed themselves to believe they had actually won. Bags of cash covered the floor. Some gang members laughed. Others counted bundles of money. According to later accounts, they even played a game of Monopoly using real banknotes instead of the game's paper money. It felt like the perfect ending. But while they celebrated, something else was happening. Miles away, the police investigation had already begun. Officers were interviewing railway staff. Emergency messages were spreading across the country. Roadblocks were being planned. Helicopters prepared to search the surrounding area. Then, the gang heard something that instantly killed the celebration. They were monitoring police radio transmissions. And one message changed everything. Investigators believed the robbers couldn't have traveled very far. Based on witness statements and the timeline, police focused their search on a relatively small area surrounding the robbery site. The gang looked at each other in silence. Their original plan had been to remain at the farmhouse for several more days. Now, staying there felt like a death sentence. Within minutes, they made a desperate decision. Leave early. Take the money. Erase every trace. Disappear before the police reached them. It sounded like the perfect escape. But perfection had already begun to crack. Because inside that farmhouse, they had unknowingly left behind something far more valuable than millions of dollars. Evidence. And once investigators found it, the greatest robbery in British history would become one of Britain's greatest manhunts. The robbers believed they had escaped with the perfect crime. But the farmhouse they left behind was about to tell investigators almost everything they needed to know. The gang had escaped. The money had been divided. And for a brief moment, it seemed like they had pulled off the perfect crime. But every perfect plan has one weakness. Sometimes, it isn't the robbery. It's what happens afterward. At the farmhouse, the gang worked quickly to erase every trace of their presence. They wiped down furniture. They cleaned doors and windows. Anything they had touched was carefully checked. Before leaving, they even gave one trusted associate a final instruction. Burn the farmhouse to the ground. If the building disappeared, so would the evidence. It was a simple task. One final job. One final chance to protect everyone. But that order was never carried out. For reasons that remain unclear, the farmhouse was abandoned instead of being destroyed. At almost the same time, police were racing against the clock. Search teams spread across the countryside. Roadblocks appeared. Helicopters searched from above. Then, a local resident reported unusual activity near a remote farmhouse on the morning of the robbery. Investigators immediately moved in. What they found wasn't millions of dollars. It was something even more valuable. Evidence. Inside the farmhouse were empty mailbags, equipment linked to the robbery, and signs that a large group had been living there. The robbers had cleaned almost everything. Almost. Then detectives noticed something completely ordinary. A Monopoly board sitting inside the farmhouse. At first, it looked meaningless. Just an old board game. But when forensic experts examined it closely, they found fingerprints that had survived the cleanup. That tiny oversight changed everything. Those fingerprints matched individuals already known to law enforcement. Within days, the investigation had a direction. The mystery gang was no longer invisible. For the first time, Scotland Yard wasn't chasing shadows. They were chasing names. And Britain's biggest robbery was about to become Britain's biggest manhunt. The perfect robbery had survived 17 minutes, but it couldn't survive one forgotten fingerprint, and the arrests were about to begin. The fingerprints had given investigators something they hadn't had before. Names. And once Scotland Yard knew who they were looking for, the race completely changed. This was no longer a search for unknown robbers. It had become a nationwide manhunt. Police officers worked around the clock. Homes were searched. Known associates were questioned. Phone calls were monitored. Every lead was followed. One by one, the gang members began to disappear. But not because they had escaped. Because they were being arrested. Each arrest brought investigators closer to the man, believed to be the architect of the entire operation. Bruce Reynolds. Unlike some of the others, Reynolds understood something important. The robbery had succeeded, but the investigation was moving even faster. The fingerprints, the farmhouse, the abandoned equipment. The perfect crime was slowly unraveling. Some gang members believed they could simply hide. Others tried to blend back into ordinary life. A few even thought the police didn't have enough evidence. They were wrong. With every arrest, another piece of the puzzle fell into place. According to the investigation, most of the gang was eventually identified and captured, while only a small number managed to avoid immediate arrest. Even then, the search continued for those still on the run. The money that had once symbolized victory had become a burden. Every large purchase attracted attention. Every careless conversation created another lead. Every day outside prison became harder than the robbery itself. Then investigators returned to one question that had never been fully answered. The gang couldn't have known so much. Without help, someone had revealed confidential information. Someone inside the system had opened the door. But despite years of investigation, that mysterious insider remained a ghost. No confirmed identity. No public confession. No final answer. And that unanswered question still hangs over the great train robbery today. Was it really just the work of criminals? Or did someone inside Britain's own system help make history? But before we answer what happened to the gang, there's one final chapter. Because the robbery didn't end with the arrests. Its legacy would change British security forever. The gang had stolen millions. But in the end, the robbery's greatest impact wasn't the money that disappeared. It was the way Britain would protect it from that day forward. The arrests made headlines around the world. Newspapers called it the crime of the century. Not because it was the most violent robbery, but because it proved something almost unthinkable. A small group of criminals had exposed weaknesses inside one of Britain's most trusted systems. For the Royal Mail, the damage wasn't measured only in money. It was measured in trust. Investigators carefully reconstructed every stage of the robbery. The fake railway signal, the isolated crossing, the movement of the high-value package carriage, the abandoned farmhouse, the fingerprints, every mistake, every success, every decision became part of a lesson. In the years that followed, security procedures surrounding high-value postal transport were strengthened. The robbery forced authorities to rethink how cash was moved and protected. But perhaps the biggest lesson had nothing to do with locks, or alarms, or armored transport. It was something far more dangerous. Information. The gang didn't succeed because they had bigger weapons. They succeeded because they knew things they were never supposed to know. And once confidential information reached the wrong hands, millions of dollars became vulnerable. Even today, one mystery refuses to disappear. Who was the insider? The person who reportedly supplied critical operational information was never publicly identified in the source material. Whether that individual escaped justice or was never conclusively identified remains unanswered. That question has fueled books, documentaries, and debates for decades. Because sometimes, the most dangerous criminal isn't the one wearing a mask. It's the one no one ever suspects. The Great Train Robbery is remembered not simply because millions were stolen, but because it changed the way Britain thought about security forever. Yet one final question still remains. Was this truly the perfect robbery? Or did one forgotten fingerprint prove that no perfect crime has ever existed? The answer depends on how you define success. In the end, the gang escaped with millions, but history would remember them for something far greater than the money they stole. On paper, the Great Train Robbery was a success. The gang stopped one of Britain's most valuable trains. They escaped with millions. And for 17 extraordinary minutes, they controlled an operation that authorities never believed was possible. But history doesn't remember crimes only by how they begin. It remembers how they end. One by one, the men who had celebrated inside that remote farmhouse watched their freedom disappear. Some were arrested within weeks. Others spent years on the run. But almost all of them eventually discovered the same truth. Escaping the robbery was far easier than escaping its consequences. Then there's the man who paid the highest price without stealing a single dollar. Train driver Jack Mills survived the attack. But the injuries and emotional trauma he suffered that night never truly left him. He was never able to return to driving trains, and years later, he died after living with the lasting effects of that violent encounter. In many ways, his story became the hidden cost of a robbery often remembered for its precision. Today, more than 60 years later, people still debate the same questions. Was the robbery only possible because someone inside the system opened the door? Could the gang have succeeded without confidential information? And perhaps the biggest question of all, was this really the perfect crime? At first glance, it certainly looked that way. Months of planning, military-level coordination, no gunfight, no police chase, a fortune stolen in less than 20 minutes. But perfection has a strange habit. It doesn't collapse because of one dramatic mistake. It collapses because of one small detail that nobody thinks matters. A fingerprint, a forgotten object, a decision made in a hurry. In the end, the gang proved that even the most carefully planned operation can fall apart because of a single overlooked moment. And perhaps that's the real legacy of the great train robbery. It wasn't a story about stealing millions. It was a story about human confidence, human error, and the dangerous illusion that any crime can ever be truly perfect. Because every perfect plan has one weakness: the people who believe it's perfect. If you enjoyed uncovering the real story behind one of history's most daring robberies, subscribe for more documentaries where we separate facts from legends and reveal the mysteries history still can't fully explain. Because sometimes, the greatest mystery isn't how a crime was committed. It's why someone believed they could get away with it.